Thank you all for joining Legendary Textiles of Indonesia. I understand that there are a number of people who love these things that might be tuning in today. This will be introductory, but I hope you'll enjoy it one way or the other. If you know all this, you could just look at the pictures because these things are just so very pretty, aren't they? I'm doing this lecture as part of a new lecture series here at the East Hawaii Cultural Center, where we're hoping to put up something once a month or so. And this month we have an exhibit of young people's art, Young at Art. And as part of the exhibit, our young people visiting are invited to make some textile designs. And they're right there behind me in the gallery, hanging on the wall. And eventually next month, we're going to hang them in Kalākaua Park across the street. So I was thinking, textiles, what can I contribute? Maybe this. Also, here at the East Hawaii Cultural Center, we have a gamelan, a Javanese bronze orchestra. The Gamelan of the Molten Blossom, under the direction of Carol Walker. I'm a member, and we are, of course, currently not meeting for all those sad reasons, but oh, I miss it. And I hope that this talk might be of interest to some of my fellow gamelan players as well. Indonesian textiles. Oh, here are a few of mine, just kind of at random, the things that are hanging on my wall or lying around the house. They're so wonderful. There's a wide variety of types and designs and colors from all over the map. So what I'm going to show you today is some of the stories and the techniques and a little bit of the history around this kind of textile, whether they are Ecots or Batiks or crazy Ecots or gold or what have you. So let's take a look here at the map, just to remind you. Indonesia is about the bottom half of this map, roughly. And the places I'll be taking you today are Java. Here, if you can see my arrow, there's Java. The main island of today's Indonesia, about 500 miles long. Way too many people. It's one of their chronic problems. We'll be looking at Bali. Everybody knows about Bali. There's Bali right there. It is part of Indonesia. Most of Indonesia is majority Muslim. Bali is unique in preserving the older Hindu culture of the islands. I'll take you to Sumatra at one point. This is the largest of the islands up here, right along the Straits of Malacca. And some of the out islands as well. Borneo here, Sulawesi, Sumba. You can see where we are. Java and Sumatra are right off the main trade routes coming from China through the Straits of Malacca on their way to India and the Indian Ocean. Also, Java is the way to the Spice Islands from the west. And so this is a very, very ancient seafaring area with lots and lots of different cultures interacting. Let me start with a little bit just on materials and techniques. Traditionally, most Indonesian textiles have been made of cotton. And until the 18th, 19th centuries, those cottons were largely homemade, homespun, and home woven, unless they could get something more special imported from India or China, later from England and Holland. But the traditional textiles, especially out in the out islands, are still hand spun today, as you can see these women doing. The woman on the left is in Sumatra, the woman on the right is in Sumba, and they have done a lot of homework. You can't just weave the cotton and then dye it. You have to actually prepare the cotton for dyeing with a variety of chemical mordants. And of course, largely those are family secrets and so on and so forth. When the cotton is ready, you can dye it. The two most prominent traditional colors in Indonesian textiles are indigo blue and red from the Morinda citrifolia, which I had to laugh. I just learned that's a close relative of the noni plant that we all know and hate from Hawaii. It's an Indian mulberry, if you will. I had no idea it made this red, but it does. These are the traditional colors. Others come in later with trade connections. There are a number of purposes for cloth. And just to remind you, it's not just sitting there in your closet to be worn. Indonesian cloth has a very strong ritual component. Region by region, the rituals are different, the meanings are different, the weaving is different. But it's important to remember that these are not just decoration. In fact, they were never just decoration. They're not just for utilitarian purposes. They are ritual. There on the left is a gigantic, gorgeous Toraja funeral hanging made out of Ecot, which I'll discuss in a minute. Oh, on the upper right there is a Sumatran tampanship cloth, which is something that is made and exchanged. There's very rigid traditional rules for who you exchange it with. If there's a wedding, you exchange these things. If there's a business promotion, some other big event, it's a traditional way for families to establish connections through a shared visual culture of these boats, which seem to represent something like spirit boats, perhaps boats to take the spirit to the next world, perhaps the boats in memory of ethnic groups' arrival in the islands. There are various stories that go with these, but they're all quite significant. Very often for ritual, you have to wear a certain kind of cloth. Of course, we're familiar with that. Think of a wedding dress, think of a tuxedo. But indeed, the different rituals, say down there in Bali, if there's a rice ritual, you wear specific kinds of cloth as you perform the ritual, because that's the way it's done. The cloths often are imbued with power. This is an amazing kind of a cloth from the Iban peoples of Borneo, where not only is the cloth itself very powerful, but the women who weave it have to be women of very high status who are allowed by the community to weave these things. The weaving patterns are passed on in secret from mother to daughter, from aunt to niece. It is a women's weaving tradition. They're astonishingly complex, beautiful weavings, often done with Ecot or other fancy dyeing techniques. But the point is that not only does the cloth have power, but the woman weaving it has power, and both of these are conveyed through the cloth. Of course, textiles are for wearing. We've all heard of sarongs. A sarong is simply a piece of cloth that's been pulled around and sewn into a skirt. That was traditionally for everyday wear. People still wear them today, men and women. It's a unisex garment. Less today than 50 years ago, but you still see them in the streets, and you still see guys wearing them as well as women. A little bit more fancy, if you take two pieces of cloth and tie them together, you might have a Dodot, like the guy there who's an aristocrat on the left. And what it does is it creates an excess of cloth that can then be draped in an artistic way. The normal way one wears the cloth in Indonesia in modern times is the kain pajang, and you see that on the right, where you take a length of cloth about 2 yards long, a single length of cloth, and you wrap it around. And of course, there's a way for men to tie it and a way for women to tie it, and if you get it wrong, everyone laughs. Textiles, of course, are very, very important in ritual performance, in court life, and in theatrical productions, which are part of court life. And it's worth remembering that throughout Indonesia, the royal courts, whether they're the grand courts of Java or tiny courts on the out islands, the courts are the repository of much of the culture. The music, the gamelan music, the dancing, the textiles, the stories that go back hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe stories from the Indian Mahabharata and Ramayana traditions, maybe stories from the old Javanese courts. And part of being a sultan or a prince is to sponsor these performances and to make sure everything is done right and everything is of the highest quality. Here's an example from the out islands. A hingi is a mantle, and you can see in the center 3 women wearing the mantle across their shoulders. These are a famous and wonderfully collectible, I should say, type of art. They're woven to be used in important celebrations. I think the 3 women in the center there are celebrating the rededication of an island temple. And any other sort of ceremony is going to require ritual use of these things. Again, they have protective qualities. Men's and women's are different. I love that one on the left with squid designs. Oh, I want that one. Now, this isn't a technique I've referred to before called Ecot. And let me get a little bit into this. And what I'm going to do today in the talk is present 3 major types of Indonesian cloth and tie them to some examples in their specific locations. Let's start with Ecot. Ecot is when you actually make the pattern before you weave the cloth. And that sounds a little crazy, but you can see maybe on the left there, this is from a museum in Bali, it's my photo, where they've shown the first stage before they actually string the loom, or I should say, once they strung the loom with the warps. Those are the long horizontal threads. They're white. They then go and will use wax to block out parts of the yarns that will resist dyes. This is why we call it dye resist. And what you do is if every time you add a color or change a color, you will redo the waxing using bound threads. In fact, Ecot means bound. So what you're actually seeing there on the left is bundles of warp yarns that have been then wound around very tightly with string, or nowadays they use plastic. Traditionally, they would use grass, they use various natural fibers. Dye the pattern in that way, put the bundled fibers back up on the loom, unbundle them, and then you can weave. It's really, really labor intensive. So the weaving goes back and forth. That's what we call weft, same word as weaving. And see, here they are doing it. A little bit of close up. On the right there, a woman is tying up the bundles of warp thread with some kind of, looks like plastic there. They'll take them off the loom then, dye them, and you can see that going on in the left, and then string the whole darn thing back up again. And then you can start the weaving process again. On the left, there's a gentleman, he's actually not from Indonesia, he's visiting from Western China, but he's weaving an Ecot. We call this warp Ecot because it is the warp threads, the long threads that bear the pattern. This is actually the easiest way to make Ecot. So what he's doing now is he's weaving back and forth with plain colored yarn. And what comes out will be, like you see on the right there, patterns that were there even before the weaving. So Ecot is an ancient technique. It's worldwide. You find it in Guatemala, you find it in India, you find it just all over. We assume these are independent developments. It's a little far-fetched to think that the Indonesians went to Guatemala to teach them how to weave. But it's very, very labor intensive, and that is part of the beauty of it. Let me take you to Bali, where we'll take a look at some of these traditions, including Ecot. Here's Bali. It's not very big. It's just a little bit bigger than the big island of Hawaii. It has something like 30 active volcanoes. Oh, no, that's Java's. They have 30. They got a lot of active volcanoes on Bali, including one you can see there on the right that blows up basically every 10 or 12 years. Gunung Agung, the great mountain, around which much Balinese religion is focused. Balinese religion is really interesting. It's the last holdout in Indonesia of Hinduism. And it's a Hinduism that came in several waves, some of it very, very ancient, directly from India, we think. And then at some point in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries, the Hindu courts of Java fled Islam and set up shop on Bali, bringing a newer form of Hinduism. But it is Hindu, it has class system. They periodically go off to India and study the texts and all of that. Much of Hinduism, you may know, involves purity and impurity, and much of Balinese religion revolves around those concepts as well, ritual purity. There are a number of deities. Officially in Indonesia, you're supposed to be monotheistic. They found a way around that, but it is polytheistic. Most of Bali is Shiva, Shaivite Hinduism, with their own local twists. A great deal of attention in traditional Bali is focused on temple rituals, bringing the temples back into use according to various calendrical cycles. They actually have 3 or 4 calendars at use at the same time. It's linked to the rice culture. And in fact, it seems that the temple rituals and the priests who follow the calendars are, amongst other things, actually regulating the irrigation of the rice paddies and the planting of the rice crop. So the religion and the agriculture that made the island so wealthy are very, very intricately connected through ritual, through performance, through textiles. Bali also preserves memories of the court life of medieval East Java, the Majapahit royal courts that got driven out of the island in the 15th century by Islam coming into Java. The architecture of Bali, these massive, great red brick gateways and temples, much of the performance preserves memories of the courts of Java. And yes, it is a textile lover's paradise. Part of the fascination people have for Bali is that, at least in the traditional areas, and who knows for how much longer, people really do base their lives around the rhythms of temple life and those intersecting calendars. Ordinary people play gamelan as something to do after work. I remember being in Bali and watching the farmers come in about 4 or 5 o'clock every day, sitting down at the local gamelan, playing some music for about an hour, moving on. Ordinary people participate in these great processions and the great rituals. When there's a funeral, it's a magnificent thing in Bali. It's so important that the soul be free to go to heaven that the power company will actually take down the power lines as a funeral procession passes so that nothing interrupts the space between the body and the soul ascending to heaven. So the rituals are just magnificent. All of these things are guarded and enhanced by specific kinds of textile, many of them made on Bali, not all of them, but Bali still has a very active textile manufacturing tradition. Now, Ecot. Remember, Ecot is when you make the pattern and you dye the pattern in successive stages before you even weave the thing. Here are 2 examples from Bali. Warp Ecot, remember, means that the pattern was made on the long yarns on the loom. This is silk. Silk is not an Indonesian product particularly, but the very wealthy have always been able to get silk from China or from India. And so the very, very fanciest of these cloths are going to incorporate silk. Sometimes silk mixed with cotton, sometimes silk pure. So these are 2 very, very fancy Ecots. The one on the left you can see is 2 lengths of cloth that have been sewn together. An endek is a wrapper, kind of an all-purpose wrapper for ritual objects, for important ceremonies. They can be abstract, or if you look there on the right, that's actually figural. And there are designs of Ramayana figures, men and women performing the great, and gods and goddesses, of course, performing the great Ramayana rituals. Here's another kind of Ecot. This is Wefty Cut on Bali. Weft is when you make the pattern on the cross threads, the weft. This is actually much harder. What you do here is that the loom, and you can see maybe in the upper right there, the woman is weaving with red warps on the loom this way, and then she's weaving back and forth. Every single weft thread has been dyed in bundles to form a pattern. Why is this harder than warp? Because with weft, she has to individually line up every single thread as she goes along to keep the pattern kind of crisp. Of course, part of the fun of Ecot is that it's never perfect. It's always a little bit shimmery, a little bit blurry, and that is considered to be part of the beauty of the art. The chepuk are very powerful protective cloths. I understand they're not particularly made anymore. The labor force has all kind of died out. I have one that I treasure and hope someday to get into a museum collection. But the most complicated Ecot of all on Bali is the very famous cloth from Tenganan called Geringsing. Tenganan is a very strange, very interesting village on the east coast of Bali, where the population appeared to be what they call Bali Aga, or Old Bali. Their Hinduism predates the Hinduism of Java. It seems to have come directly from India. They do not venerate Shiva as their highest god. They venerate Indra, which is very archaic. We'd love to know more about their history. There are lots and lots of legends. There are shipwreck legends and all sorts of things, but they seem to have brought from India not only particular archaic Hinduism, but also this extraordinary cloth technique, garingsing. What is it? It is double Ecot, which means that the pattern has been dyed both on the warps and on the wefts before weaving, and the woman who weaves this thing has to sit there and get it all lined up right. And if you look at the picture here, you can maybe see that the pattern is a little bit blurry, a little bit wavy in both directions, both vertically and horizontally, because thread by thread, they are lining it all up. You can see her at work here in the upper right, and literally she's putting in one weft thread at a time, lining it up just right, and then beating it into place, and then proceeding to the next one. On the left, you can see a garingsing loom at work. And one of the interesting things about this is, for ritual reasons, this isn't just a piece of cloth with a beginning and end. No, the warps on the loom are circular, and so there is no beginning, there is no end. It's a continuous piece of cloth and one big loop on the loom. It's very, very special. How do I happen to have a piece of this? Very simply because for many of the rituals it's used in, it can only be used once. For instance, in a funeral ritual, a piece of garingsing will cover the body of the dead. And after that, it is ritually impure, and the villagers will simply dispose of it, except nowadays people like me come in as tourists and we really love this stuff, and so they simply sell it to us. But that's why it's available for collecting. What are some of the powerful rituals? And this goes beyond the village of Tenganan. All of Bali respects the power of garingsing double Ecot. The coming of age ceremony in Bali traditionally is tooth filing, and I'm just not going there today. But you notice that these young women are dressed to the T and all made up, and they are leaning back, and they are about to have their canine teeth filed a little bit flatter, and they are protected, you can see under them, with layers and layers of ritually powerful garingsing. You also see it all over Indonesia, guarding things like coffins or sacred treasures. And you can see down the lower left there, garingsing is used to encircle throne stools for the gods. So this is amazing stuff. Where does it come from? We're not really sure, but it certainly looks like the inspiration came from Gujarat in Western India. And Gujarati traders have been trading across the Indian Ocean and through the Straits of Malacca forever. They've been trading with Indonesian islands forever. And it is the only other place except Okinawa where anybody today is still weaving double Ecot. It is so immensely time consuming. It always is a textile of great prestige, and that's true in India. In India, it's something that you splurge on for a great wedding, for instance. And we know that since forever, garingsing or patola cloth from India has been traded throughout Indonesia, where there are lots and lots of copies of it. So on the right here, there is a gentleman holding a piece of patola double Ecot from Gujarat, and on the right is an imitation, or at least a similarity in pattern in woven double Ecot. Sometimes in Indonesia, it's actually woven like the garingsing, sometimes just printed because it is so difficult to make. But for centuries, that has been a very popular power pattern throughout Indonesia. There are other Balinese cloths that are just fascinating. This is a very simple one, black and white checks, and comes in variety. And if you are going to participate in a ritual, and if you're a guy, you may very well go off to the cloth store, pick some up, and wrap it around you because it is very protective. It reflects the dualism of Balinese belief, which gives honor both to the good and to the demonic forces that are present all throughout the atmosphere. I saw a movie once where a Western tourist told a Balinese priest, well, he didn't really believe in the gods being everywhere. And the Balinese priest looked at him shocked and said, where exactly don't you see the gods? They're everywhere in Bali. And part of ritual is, as I say, paying honor both to the spirits of the air, but also to the demons of the earth. And that's represented in black and white, which is considered protective for anybody involved in whatever ritual. For instance, this man on the left is going to be performing Rangda, the witch demon, in a performance. And these performances are dead serious. They're temple entertainment for the gods. It's a very, very dangerous moment for him. He is vulnerable to possession because that's the point. He's not just dancing. He's going to be possessed by Rangda. And so to protect him physically, he is wearing a chepuk, Ecot, that orange, red, gold thing down below. He's wearing black and white polling, checkered above. And then on the right, you can see him finally all suited up. And none of that is really very apparent, but it's necessary. All right, that was my quick romp through Bali. Let me take you to a second great location, Sumatra, the great island in the west of Indonesia, where there are quite different textile traditions. One of the most prominent these days and for centuries now has been the use of gold thread, gold and silver thread, brocaded into the weaving. We call this technique songket. Again, this cloth is used all over Indonesia, but is particularly identified with the weavers of Sumatra. Now, is it really gold? Is it really silver? Apparently, it has not been for maybe a couple hundred years. There are imitation gold and silver, first on paper and now on, I think, plastic, I hate to say it, or other ways to make gold and silver thread. But apparently in the good old days, there are examples they have of cork textiles literally being made with thread that had been dipped in liquid gold and liquid silver and then woven. Oh my goodness. It's still being done. There's a 19th century photograph of a songket weaver on Sumatra in modern day today. Still being done. I get these from Wikipedia, so I believe everything they say. Traditionally, the weaving was done by women, but as so often around the globe, as production has gotten more industrial, men have moved into the workforce for weaving as well. The traditional division in most of Indonesia was men would do the dyeing processes and women would do the weaving processes. That's gotten complicated in recent years. The songket technique is particularly identified with one of the great ethnic groups in Indonesia, the Minangkabau people on Sumatra. Who are these people? They live on West Sumatra along the coastline and up in the mountains, primarily, in fact. They identify with the water buffalo. And so their architecture traditionally, their headdresses, all sorts of things kind of reflect the horns of a water buffalo. They're a very successful, highly educated, highly motivated commercial group, still very active in today's Indonesia, and great consumers of songket cloth. Now look at that wedding photo. Oh my goodness, again, I get this from Wikipedia. They have all sorts of wedding photos of young Minangkabau couples just dripping with gold jewelry, gold headdresses, and gold embroidered cloth. This stuff is just spectacular. And it's one route I think a lot of us had into the textiles of Indonesia. The first show I saw at the Textile Museum in Washington of Indonesian textiles featured this stuff, and I just couldn't believe how incredibly beautiful it was. You've got cloths like, oh, there's an end piece on the left there. Now that's actually from from Bali. Bali also does a lot of songket, where you've got a combination of Ecot, and you've got songket woven in as an embroidery, or sorry, not an embroidery, but actually as a brocade woven right into the cloth on the ends. You've got songket gold tassels. This is just spectacular stuff. Still very much in use today. in Bali and the nearby island of Lombok. Here's a wedding party from 1998. You can tell the bride, by the way, she's the one with the parasol and the eyeglasses. Apparently eyeglasses are a status thing. Okay, who knew? And her bridesmaids are all wearing spectacular new songket, gold woven cloth. Let's take a look at Java now, the main island of Indonesia today, with at least 100 million people on it, crammed in, it's famously overcrowded. It has a number of spectacular cloth traditions, but the most famous one is batik. And it's identified, I'm going to show it to you in two groups. First of all, I'm going to show you Central Java here, the great courts of Yogyakarta and Surakarta, close to Mount Merapi, which is constantly erupting. This is what I mean by Central Java, the courts of Central Java. I'm also going to take you up to the north coast here, particularly to Cirebon, that's how you spell it, Cirebon, and the towns around Cirebon, which have a very, very different tradition of cloth making. Batik. Batik is the fabled cloth of the Javanese courts. And oh, these are three of my pieces. None of them are very good, but I love the patterns. Let me talk a little bit about this stuff. Batik is where you start with a woven cloth of cotton, usually. You can also do it on silk. But you take the blank cloth, prepare it to receive wax. And that, just preparing it, is family secrets off the charts. What the woman is doing there is she is making a design by hand. Tulis is what we call it. Batik tulis means batik drawn by hand, using a wax chanting. The chanting is that little pipe thing. You put hot wax into it, and you can see over here, there's little spouts. There's one or a bunch or a whole bunch, and these are what you draw with. So she's holding one of these little pens. It's like a fountain pen for hot wax, and she's making this design. It's probably been drawn out in advance, but then again, she might be of a certain age where she can simply do it from memory. Traditionally, these places are crowded. This is a photo from mid-20th century, and the place I visited in Yogyakarta looked about like that, where you've got a bunch of women working at the same time, using a common vat of hot wax right here to refill their chanting pens. Each one's doing a different design. In the old days, this was a family craft, and women in general learned how to do this in the home. And I'm talking not just common working folk, but right up into the princes or princesses of the courts, very much in the way that embroidery was something that all women of any quality at all would learn to do in pre-modern Europe, including royal princesses. So traditionally you did batik for your own family or for your own social group or for your own court. Nowadays it's done larger scale, but you can still get it done by hand here, and that's what they're all doing. How long does it take to do this? I see figures like, oh, anywhere from 45 days to a year for the whole process on a single piece of cloth, because it requires repeated steps. You can also do it quick. In the 19th century, as batik industrialized, the factories developed and they started using large copper stamps so that you can stamp a repeating design. And this became men's work. The stamps are big and heavy, and that's just the way it worked out. So you can see here at the bottom, a man who is stamping a pattern of wax to be dyed, and up above a series of kinds of stamps that nowadays are so beautiful that they're collected all by themselves, even without the cloth. Chop. By the way, if you're wondering, that C in Indonesian, a C is pronounced CH, chop. So that's a chop. And that other thing is a chanting. Okay, what you do to make the various colors is you dye in stages. And here's an example you can see on the left. This is the first waxing. What they're going to do is they're going to use wax to block out anything they do not want dyed. So in this case, they simply want, apparently they're going to start with this yellow-brown. So this is after the first dyeing, they've got the yellow-brown, And then they're going to either scrape or boil the wax off and redo the wax in such a way that it protects everything that's been dyed and opens up some areas for indigo. Here is another stage. This is all the same piece of cloth where they're adding more indigo, and this time they're letting the indigo penetrate this light brown so it becomes a rich soba brown. Soba is the classic brown in central Java. It's from some tree bark or other, and on they go. So sometimes they're adding single colors, sometimes they're adding colors, two colors to darken them, to enrich them. A green, for instance, is made by doing blue and then redoing it yellow, and so on and so forth. And then finally at the bottom, you've got a very, very complicated piece of cloth. So you can have up to maybe 12 stages of dyeing, I should say waxing, dyeing, scraping it off, waxing it again, dyeing it again, scraping it off until you finally have a finished piece of cloth. Again, 45 days to a year is what I hear for old-fashioned handmade batik. And here I'm watching it being done. I'm at the Winoto Sastro factory in today's Joe Jakarta. I was there in 2005, watching them do this thing. Lots and lots of women at work at the same time, lots and lots of men dyeing at the same time, lots and lots of tourists taking it all in and walking off with pieces, of course. And yes, they even let us try. I'm kind of embarrassed, but this is my one humble attempt at batik, and I am humbled. So they gave me the tulis, the chanting, the little wax pen. They gave me this piece of cloth. They let me make a mess on it. She helped me out. At one point, I just kind of gave up, or time was up or something, and she kind of gently took over and finished waxing this awful design I was trying to work on. She was kind enough not to laugh. They took it off. They dipped it in a blue dye, and then boiled the wax off, and on the right there, you can see my lame result. The sort of Hawaiian meets Javanese meets professor, right? What are the origins of this wonderful, wonderful cloth? We don't really know. It seems to have been widespread in late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages. We find pieces, cloth is so hard to preserve. It's very rarely preserved archaeologically, but every now and then a little fragment is preserved. There's a piece on the upper right from Mamluk Egypt, 14th century, which appears to be wax resist dyed cotton, okay? And down below is a 14th century piece, again from Gujarat in Western India. And there's a whole class of these things that don't appeal to Gujarat taste, but seem to have been made specifically for the Indonesian market. So just like that double Ecot patola cloth that we saw being imported from Gujarat, they were also importing wax resist dyed batik. Did the Indonesians pick it up from them? Did they invent it themselves? We really don't know. We just don't have stuff old enough to tell us. We do know that by the 17th century, there's a very lively market in Western Java, in part because Java in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries converts to Islam. This is when the Hindu courts tie off to Bali, and one by one, the great courts of Java either convert to Islam or simply run off to Bali and hide. And this is when you really get a lot of crossover between Indian Gujarati merchants and Chinese merchants, and Thai merchants are in there, and Banten. Banten is one of the great Muslim cities in Java on the north coast, and they start trading and mixing and matching dye stuffs, patterns, and so on in a way that's more familiar today with the way one market will, say, produce goods for another market in a different country to buy. Let's bring in the Dutch. Until 1945, Indonesia was known as the Dutch East Indies. I hate to be reminded of that. The Dutch East India Company arrives and by 1619 has set up shop on the north coast of Java in a new city they call Batavia, we call it Jakarta. And this becomes the linchpin of Dutch trading in the Spice Islands. VOC, no, I'm not going to try it in Dutch. It stands for United Eastern Trading Company. And you can see their symbol down there in the lower right, the VOC symbol. They create sort of a mini Amsterdam in Fort Batavia. And you can still see bits and pieces of it today under modern Jakarta, which is rapidly sinking into the sea. Oh dear. The Dutch built canals. Of course they built canals and steep roofed houses to keep off the snow load. This is basically on the equator. And famously, it was the world's worst climate in those days, and much of the VOC was doomed by dysentery, malaria, and all of those other tropical woes that come along if you have a sea level city in the tropics, made mostly of canals. But the rulers of Central Java to this day were the courts of Yogyakarta particularly, and also Surakarta or Solo. They're about 30 miles from each other. They're not far apart. The Dutch, of course, did a good job of busting it up. It was the single state of Mataram, an Islamic state with a sultan. And the Dutch found ways to break it into at least 4 different courts. Always a good idea if you're trying to rule the locals. But to this day, the Sultan of Yogyakarta is in fact the most powerful man in Yogyakarta and much of central Java. The constitution kind of get fudged around the edges, and I just read a few years ago they upped his powers once again because he seems to keep control and do a good job, and that's not true of just everybody. By the way, you notice I'm saying Jogjakarta, and you're seeing Y's, and you're saying, why is he saying that? Oh, blame the Dutch, it's a long story. It's pronounced Jogjakarta or just Jogja for short. The Batik of Joe Jakarta is very distinctive. It's quite sober. It's done basically only in indigo blue, soba brown, and the white or the cream color of the base. And the pattern you're seeing here is a very famous one. It's the Parang Roussak, which is a series of kind of squiggle designs that shimmy along a diagonal, and probably derive from the kris, which is the ceremonial ritual knife of Java. You've seen them, they have kind of wavy blades very often. They are necessary for formal wear of any traditional Javanese man. He's going to be wearing a kris, whether it's simple or a humble man, or whether it's something made out of meteorite metal and studded with gems, which is what the Sultan is probably wearing. But as part of your costume, you just always have on in any kind of formal dress. So you see they're wearing this Parang Roussak pattern, and they're also wearing the kris, though you can't see it here, it's behind their back on the belt. Oh, actually you can see one here. He's wearing a kris, it's in a sheath there, like a sword sheath. This particular pattern is identified directly with the court. In fact, often there were laws against copying it by commoners, and it is so ritually protective. There's a whole number of talismanic garments that have come down to us. For instance, this is a baby wrapper. Early 20th century, it's probably about 2 yards long, and on either end, part of the batik dyeing has inscribed it in Javanese with a series of protective prayers to keep the child from sickness. So this would be a wrap for a royal baby in the court. In fact, here are a number of designs that at one point or another were forbidden to commoners. Java had even before, well, especially before Islam, had a very caste-based society. And to the present day, there's a great deal of awareness of aristocracy. So these are patterns that until modern days, only the courts were allowed to use. This would be published. Up at the top there, you see the Parang Roussak and some variations. And down on the bottom, there are other patterns that are more nature-based. Leaves, birds, cluttered gardens. Each one has a specific name. There are something like 1,000 different named patterns in Java. And it's interesting, we tend to look at what's in the foreground, but the pattern names actually refer to the structure of the background onto which other designs may be imposed. Again, a reminder that these great royal courts are the protectors of the culture. This is absolutely true today as it was 200 years ago. If one's lucky enough to go to the Kraton Joe Jakarta or the Manakunagaran in Solo, one will hear the very best gamelans. Some of these gamelans are 200 years old, bronze instruments. You will see the very finest traditional dances done to the gamelan music. You will see the very finest cloth being worn by the dancers. And it's never been my luck, but I suppose if you're lucky enough, you would even have perhaps the Sultan in attendance, because part of his job is to oversee the continuity of the very highest culture in music, in dance, in theater, and in cloth design. You can see some of this particular pattern even in the puppet shows or in the performances. On the left there is a princess. She's a puppet, a wooden puppet, Wayang Golek. She is wearing the Parang Roussak pattern, showing that she's royal, she's part of the court, and she's going to be acting out some established stage drama with her other puppet friends. Around the right here, this is actually, I met him. He's on Bali. He's a dancer. He's dancing Chakil, which is a demon character, very well-known character, and he is also wearing the Parang Roussak along with a number of other textiles and jewels and headdresses and masks and all the rest of it that make up the great performance arts of Indonesia. Sadly, our gamelan here at the East Hawaii Cultural Center was scheduled to host a dancer such as the man on the right last fall, but you can guess that our gamelan is currently shut down and the performance was canceled, but perhaps we can bring him back once the crisis is over and we come back into operation. I'd love to see these dances being done with our gamelan playing music. Again, things are always complicated. And when the Dutch move in and Java becomes part of an ever wider global network of commercial relations. I love that picture on the left, Hamengkubuwono VII, Sultan of Joe Jakarta, arm in arm with the Dutch factor. The photo is actually larger, it's from about 1900, and it's interesting, the Sultan is surrounded by his symbols of power, which are a retinue of courtiers dressed in batik, and he is sheltered by a forest of umbrellas. And the Dutch factor is surrounded by his symbols of authority, which are a lot of soldiers with swords. Let's take a look at what happens on the north coast. We've just been down here in central Java and Yogyakarta and Surakarta. Let's move up here to Cirebon in the north coast. Totally different batik tradition. Cirebon is the most important court in the north coast of Java. The court itself is Muslim, the Sultan is Muslim, but Cirebon has a very strong Chinese population and has long had extensive connections to the wider Islamic world, whether it's Gujarat or Aceh or on Sumatra or any of the other Muslim trading centers. And if you look at the photos on the bottom here, there's the main palace. There are actually 4 courts now in Cirebon, but the main palace is here at the Kasepuhan Kraton, or palace. It's got a great kind of Chinese cloud pattern gate. And inside on the wall, you can see Dutch Delft tiles. Hey, they were open to everything. This is also well positioned to trade directly with China. And that's very much part of the story. So in Cirebon, you not only have native Javanese, but you've got a strong community of Muslim traders who identify not so much as Javanese, but who identify more as Arabs, the way people in Aceh tend to do. And many of them were in fact Acehnese. So they're Muslims with a stronger connection to the Indian Ocean than most Javanese. You also find Chinese moving in great numbers from the 17th century on, despite all sorts of prohibitions by the Qing dynasty against Chinese living abroad and trading abroad. Yeah, well, the Chinese have been very active trading in the Straits of Malacca since probably the 15th century. and by the 17th century are moving in with entire factories and trading warehouses. The different batiks that are created around Cirebon and surrounding communities, again, these are named patterns. These are familiar patterns. They're very, very precise. This is probably circa 1900, but it's an older design than that. Excuse me. It represents the courtly garden of the Sultan. Now, being a Muslim, he's a little careful about showing the human figure in his batiks. Doesn't seem to be quite so concerned about animals. There are royal lions. There's the Garuda figure often. The Hindu Garuda figure, the semi-human, semi-bird figure that accompanies Vishnu. In Islam, he kind of turns into the Buraq, the miraculous steed of the Prophet Muhammad, who took him to heaven. You can kind of see some Buraq figures and some lion figures hanging around in this batik. Throughout the 19th century, the technology develops on the North Coast, and the stuff becomes way more flamboyant than anything ever produced in Central Java, in those conservative courts using just blue and brown and white. No. Up on the North Coast, the constant web of commerce is pushing dye stuffs far beyond natural dyes into aniline dyes and other artificial dyes. They're doing factory production long before Central Java, where you actually set up a factory with maybe 150 workers, all doing this stuff on an industrial scale. They're trading with Singapore, they're trading with China, they're trading with India, they're trading with Aceh. They're increasingly favoring extremely intricate designs, sometimes even woven with gold, like the sonkat. Now look at this thing. There's a bit, about half of it you can see on the right, with highly elaborate patterns at the end. And on the left, I've got a detail there showing a tendril design that's completely inhabited with fantastic birds and animals. Typically, the pattern goes by the old-fashioned name of tumpal semen, which is what you call tendril background, expressing an abundance of life, fertility, and then you can populate those vines with anything you want, and it's still, the design is known by the tendril name. There are specific batiks made in the North Coast for the Islamic market. Some of these are for the locals. A lot of these are to be shipped to Aceh, in the far northwest Sumatra, which has always been the part of Indonesia with the strongest direct links to Mecca and the Sunni world in general. These are headcloths. They're made in a batik style called batik Arab. Why? Because if you look closely, you'll see that these things are entirely inscribed in Arabic. Oh, and you can make out, if you know your Arabic, you can make out the holy formula, La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. These are headcloths for men to wear. So they would have all this, again, it's talismanic. They would have all of this writing on a square piece of cloth, put it on their head, fold it into a turban design, and be very well protected indeed. And as many of you know, in Southeast Asia particularly, the head is very, very sacred. You do not touch anybody else's head. You just don't do it. And so this is further protection. The Chinese are making specialty cloths as well. These are altar cloths. Any Chinese temple and any Chinese family temple in the home is going to have an altar to place offerings to the ancestors or the spirits or the god represented. And there's always going to be a little frontal hanging down. And you can see each of these, there's a short horizontal band at the top that's going to lay on top of the altar, weight it down with fruit baskets or candles or whatever. And then the picture is going to hang in front of the altar. There's a huge variety of these things. They show dragons, they show qilins, they show Chinese temples, they show just wonderful floral designs, what have you. And these are all done in batik. Again, often elaborated with embroidery or even with gold embroidery. Sonkat. Oh, look at these figural batiks. This one I really love. It's from 1860s probably. It's an elaborate batik that shows Chinese celebrations in a North Javanese town setting. And so up here, you can't quite see it, but there's a gamelan playing and dancers dancing to the gamelan. You've got a dragon parade. You've got somebody being served tea in the garden and other wonderful things. This identification with the Chinese population is very strong, and particularly Cirebon is famous for these wonderful cloud band patterns, the Megamendum batiks. I have a piece of this, I love it. It comes in red, which by the way, no Central Javanese touch red. Chinese do, North Coast does. So in a drama, a figure dance dressed in this is going to be actually identified as a Chinese character. Oh, moving to the modern times, the Chinese designs get more and more elaborate, again, using new technologies, ever more fine production. As some of you know, the Chinese have had a rough time in modern Indonesia. They were sort of a middle class that ended up on the wrong side of the heap after independence in 1945. But with independence, we get the final batik I want to point out, which is called Batik Indonesia. Once it kicked out the Dutch, kicked out the Japanese, put the Chinese under supervision, the governments of Sukarno and Suharto encouraged a revival of batik designs and encouraged particularly the merging of designs from the North Coast with designs from Central Java, encouraged individual artists to push the limits, funding research institutes and all of those things, both into the history of batik and into its new production. So to this day, we've got active batik designers with big names. Here's Ahmed Zaid. He identifies as Arab Javanese, and he's famous for his incredibly intricate designs using all manner of machine, hand, and stamped designs, all manner of different dyes in combination with each other. Some of the other designers are doing variants on traditional design like this, or Parak Rusang design, the court design of Central Java. Look at that up at the top. Somebody has said, hey, let's have fun and squish the central bands. So nowadays, everybody can have Parang Roussak if they want, and you can do funny things. The artist down here at the bottom, this is one of my pieces, has done the Parang Roussak design, but in bright blue, and then decorated it with flowers. This is very much a North Coast, but modern Batik Indonesia kind of design. Worth remembering that despite all of the innovations, despite all the mixing, the traditional textiles of Indonesia are also very much alive and well, very much alive in their ritual setting. There is the current Sultan of Jakarta, Hamengkubuwono X, still alive, been there since 1989. And on the right there, one of my photos of his court with courtiers wearing wonderful conservative Central Javanese batik with their krisses slung behind them, slinking along, very alus, very refined, which is the word they like to use. So on that note, I think I will end. Thank you so much for your participation. That's me, 2005, and my buddy Inyoman Swastika. These days, I guess you call that cultural appropriation, but you know, in my days, that was simply called dressing respectfully for temple, and that's where we were headed. So a little reminder that we do have this Young at Art program at the EHCC continuing through the month, and we would love to have your kids come and do some textiles, and we'll hang them in Kalākaua Park if you want. And maybe someday our beautiful, beautiful gamelan will reopen in our Bob Brown Gamelan studio. So thank you so much for your interest, your participation, and especially thank Monique and Kelly for their help with all of this. Now, if I can figure out how to do it, I will. I don't know how to do this. Let's see. Escape. There we are.
There.
I'll be, Bob, tell me what to do. I don't know what to do here. How can I open this for questions?
Stop sharing. Up the top, stop sharing. Up at the top of the screen, it says stop share.
Okay. Stop.
No, way at the top. Way up.
Way at the top, I don't see it, but I'll believe you.
Isn't there a stop? When you put the cursor up there, does it go? Does it show up?
Stop sharing.
Well, in that case, we can all just
I
take
haven't a clue.
we'll just do that. If everyone will just take those two little lines that separate the presentation from the pictures, so two little lines in the middle, if you put your cursor there, you shove it all over to the left, you'll make everyone come in sight.
Aha, it just popped down. Got it. There we go. Okay, I'll be very happy. Emily, hi, Emily.
Hi, Larry.
Betty, hi, Betty. This is nice. I'll be happy to take any questions. Shout them out if you would, or I'll be happy not to.
I have a quick,
Yes,
sorry.
ma'am.
Oh, I have a quick comment question. When you mentioned the mordant, I remember, and I'm not sure where, the country, but it was in Western South America. They used llama urine on their woolen textiles. And I knew that a lot of cultures use urine. And I wonder if this is why they were being discreet about their formula.
It's a good question. Urine is very widely used as a mordant. If you go to Morocco and you go to Fez, the public lavatories, well, they don't actually explain it to you, but it's made pretty obvious that the public lavatories connect directly to the dye lots at the bottom of the hill. So you do your business and you're contributing to the textile economy of Morocco. The mordants come in all sorts of flavors. I don't think it's just urine. I don't remember offhand what some of the ingredients are, but that is a common one, yeah. Yeah, mordant for everybody else. Mordant is the chemical that you use to treat cloth, particularly cotton, which does not take dye very well. Silk does, cotton doesn't. So you have to beat it up with chemicals and sometimes beat it up physically as well. Other questions?
I was wondering for the Ecot, which is so difficult today, is there any automated way of doing Ecot other than by hand? Any looms?
There's all sorts of variations in the level. The most time consuming, the most labor consuming, the most prestigious is the Batik tulis, which is done. Oh wait, you asked about Ecot.
Yes.
Ecot.
I'm sorry,
Ecot.
I'm thinking about Batik. Ecot, no, I don't know of any fast way to do Ecot. That's part of the point of it. What they do, if you want to be fast, and you see this, say, in Western China, where Ecot is part of the Uyghur culture, you can buy it hand done, you can buy it machine done. It doesn't look right machine done, and if you're really cheap, you can buy it printed. Where, of course, it's not Ecot at all, it's just a printed Ecot kind of design. A few years ago, Ecot hit the international fashion market, and I think at this point, anything goes. Yeah, other questions? Yes, sir. Hi, Betty.
Are there places that are selling traditional Indonesian batik or Ecot in the US? Like, I don't know.
There are places, absolutely. I'm wearing a shirt from Winoto Sastro factory in Java. That is all Batik tulis. It's hand done batik. That's the place where they even let us try our hand at the chanting. And I made a mess of it. But yes, there is high-end batik still being made. Ecot as well. If you go to Bali, that's more an Ecot place. And there are still places weaving Ecot. There are museums of Ecot. And there's still little old ladies in Tenganan Village and young ladies too, who are making double Ecot, if you're up for that as well. So yeah, these are live arts.
If you were doing it
Hi,
in
Carol.
the US, would you still call it Ecot or batik? I mean, I think there are people who are working with the dyes and the wax, and I think in Hawaii we have some people who are trying to do that, right?
I don't know a thing about it. I'm hoping to find out. I didn't realize there were people still doing Ecot in Hawaii. I know there are people that are growing dye stuffs.
Right.
So I guess that makes sense. And batik, actually, no, yeah, okay, I'm aware about it. Yeah, it is being done in Hawaii, you're right. Ooh, I have to go hunting. Any other questions? Yeah, Emily.
Oh, I can just, yeah, okay. My question was, I have some Indonesian batik that's a little older It's
Mhm.
not super modern. And it feels, it's cotton, but it has like a finish on the surface of the cloth. It almost feels like silk, although not quite. And I'm wondering, what is that? Is that wax? Is that just the being rubbed so many times?
Okay, it's going to be wax amongst other things, and if you smell it, it should smell a little bit like beeswax, if it's the real stuff.
Huh.
That goes away with washing, but the new stuff has a really strong beeswax smell to it.
Huh.
Also, I understand that the Chinese taste on the North Coast favored a shiny surface, and so they would take one extra step and actually burnish the surface. And I'm wondering if maybe that's what you've got. I don't think I've seen it, but I'd love to check it out sometime.
Okay.
Other questions? Yeah, Carol.
And in Singapore, we call the combination of the Chinese with the local Malaysians, whatever, Peranakan.
Yeah.
They're Peranakan. They have their own culture, right, through the ages. So what do they call the Cirebon people?
They also use Peranakan as a term.
Okay, all right.
That they're on both sides of the straits. Yeah, so same as in Singapore. The Peranakan are, as you said, they're a mixed population of Chinese who've been there forever and intermarried with the local population. And they kind of have their own version of what it is to be Chinese.
Yes.
Throw in some Portuguese, throw in some Dutch, throw in some Javanese, and you've got Peranakan. Yeah.
They have their own. Okay, Peranakan. Okay.
Yeah, Dietra.
Sorry, just quick question. How did they make textiles before the Dutch, before the cotton? I'm guessing the cotton was imported, right?
Yes, it was.
So before they had the cotton, how did they make their textiles? What did they make them of?
It's a good question. Indonesian islands, they've been using cotton for as long as India's been growing it. And originally they would use primarily Indian imported cotton and then spin it, or there was also a local cotton industry. What the Dutch did, and I didn't get into that. What the Dutch did is they introduced factory-made cotton cloth, which is much, much finer. And so they kind of displaced the local cotton weaving industry. It's one of the impacts of the Dutch on Javanese textiles. Nowadays, the cotton comes mostly from China. And again, it's much, much finer. And that's part of the increase in fineness of design with North Coast batik, is that you can make finer designs with North Coast batik on factory-made cotton sheets. Earlier, they were doing batik on hand-woven, hand-spun cotton, which is really pretty rough stuff, no matter how much you try to make it fine. So yeah, that's changed. That's a very good question. Other?
Not everyone might have seen. Carol Walker put something up in the chat window that you might not have seen about buying batik. She says there's a website called mybatikshop.com.
Okay, I don't know, and I think I won't comment, but I might very well check it out after the talk. I've bought my stuff all over. I've traveled in Southeast Asia a bit. I also lived for a long time in Washington, D.C., where some of you know the Textile Museum is. I was a member for a long time, learned much of what I know there and bought stuff. There are also good textile collections in this and that museum in the US. I suspect that's also a place where you can probably find them in the gift store. The LA County Museum, the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, the Honolulu Museum of Art, the Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts, all have remarkable textile collections, probably obtainable there. Okay, any other questions? Okay, thank you so much for your company. And I do invite you, if you've got kids and if you're in Hilo, please participate in our textile activities for this month, or come back to our gamelan when please our gamelan comes back. Thank you all so much.